Okay, our guest this week is Travis Wagner. He's an assistant professor at the School of Information Science, the University of Illinois, Champaign Urbana campus, part of the Midwest. And so, Travis, for listeners of this podcast, Travis is a little bit, just a little bit off the beaten track. And the reason they're on is because I saw them give this incredible, like mind bending talk at the Northeastern Historic Film Archive Symposium, whose name I may have just butchered, but like, which shout out to what a cool organization, what a cool space in the thriving metropolis of Bucksport, Maine. Okay, so the title of the article that this talk was based on is I like the narrative of curating what we watch, the curatorial worlds of retro conversion artists. And if you're not aware of what retro conversion is, that's okay, because I guess a growing number of the population are, but it's wild. So maybe that's a good place to start, Travis. Thank you so much for being on the show. And what in God's name is a retro conversion artist?
Yeah, so it's not a term that existed to my knowledge prior to doing this research. I became fascinated in this phenomena that I was noticing in a lot of media collector spaces and on Instagram, Etsy, all of these vendor artist sites where people were openly selling media, contemporary media that was converted back onto an objectively older and obsolete format, in particular VHS tapes. And because I'm a social scientist at training, I had to have some sort of way of categorizing these group of people. And it wasn't that they were just doing bootlegging, and I'm sure we'll get into discussion about how it's different from that, or that they were just doing piracy, but they were explicitly taking something that was never intended or designed to be on this obsolete format and re-releasing it. So I was like, oh, it's retro. They're converting things. There's lots of fancy media theory that I'm half familiar with that describes these types of processes, but it wasn't explicitly like remediation or bootlegging. So I collectively called it this act of retro conversion. And as I'm sure we will also discuss, it was a term that the folks I talked to didn't claim themselves, although some of them took it on as a moniker and now refer to themselves that way. So yeah, it was this particular act of taking new media and putting it onto an older, lesser obsolete format.
So okay, so let's like, because I feel like that is not quite fully doing justice to the insanity of what, and again, like getting to see some of these clips, guys, it's amazing. So right, we're all used to bootlegging, where you copy something onto a form of media,
Mhm.
and sometimes you copy it into a quote unquote less advanced form of media, more advanced form of media. Right, you can rip CDs to MP3s, you can burn MP3s into CDs. God knows, in a past life, I was, and then of course there's retro media, right? Like
Mhm.
I was played in a garage punk band that was on a tape label in Brooklyn, cassette tapes only, well after anyone was making cassette tapes. And there are arguments for why that's neat, and there's arguments for like why that was actually made a certain level of economic sense, but that is not what this is. This is people taking compilations of YouTube videos and putting them onto fancy
Mhm.
VHSs, among other
Among
things.
other things, right? Yeah.
So like maybe like tell us some of your favorites.
Yeah.
There's such amazing stuff.
Yeah, and I do want to sort of put some categories here, right? Sometimes it was straight up, and I'm not going to name names, right? I'm not going to narc on anybody, but like somebody would straight up take um Born Digital, like Five Nights at Freddy's, and put that onto VHS. So that was one component. You didn't see me screen that because that's obviously like a wildly illegal thing to do, but it was
Wait,
also the
Five Nights at Freddy the
movie.
movie or Five Nights at Freddy like video of people playing the Five Nights at Freddy game?
Oh, well, actually, some of both, right? Like a little bit of both. So there was like explicitly releasing the movie without licenses onto these tapes, but then there would be compilations of like gameplay footage. But yeah, I think some of my favorite stuff would be these very new media genres like YouTube compilations of internet videos, vaporwave type video compilations. A favorite example that I think you saw me mention but not screen was like taking the Resident Evil 4 video game cutscenes, re-editing them together, and then releasing them as a tape with the movie on them, right? So understand that there's like a sort of demediation that's very intentionally putting things onto this older format. Yeah. So that's I think more
Yeah,
specifically
yeah,
what's
yeah. And
going
so
on
yeah,
here.
because it contains multitudes that there are, but so
Mhm.
and so there is this incredible like, creative act, but all yeah, very much ignoring copyright,
Mhm.
and you kind of maybe one of the ways into this because it's a really fascinating mind spinning phenomena is you kind of argue that a key point for a lot of folks was honestly something as not a film person particularly. I hadn't that did not surprise me, but I hadn't known in particular it happened. Was that a bunch of people bought Paramount content or thought they owned Paramount content, but in fact only rented access to Paramount content that was ripped away from them as a result of corporate
Mhm.
mishigas, for lack of a better word.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm sure you and then folks who listen to podcasts are familiar with like the D Digital Millennium Copyright Act, right? And the sort of ways
Mm-hmm.
that a container becomes this abstract thing in which like a piece of media exists inside of, right? So, a lot of what was happening in media spaces was like you buy license to the example that kept coming up when I was interviewing folks was Ice Road Truckers, right? Nobody cares about that show, but it was just like
Really, they kept bringing up Ice Road
I think it was
Truckers.
just like the example that was in the news about this thing. But if you purchased all 7 or 8 seasons of Ice Road Truckers, you weren't actually purchasing ownership of that. You were purchasing a container that you circulated, right? So you're basically renting a license and not owning that license. So Sony on a lot of their platforms just removed everything. So a lot of the folks that I talked to were suddenly questioning what it meant to own media in a digital form, right? And their response, rather than I think what we've historically seen, would be to just go torrent or otherwise access media in a very digital way, was to find the media that they adored. Again, both very theatrical releases and then these new media genres that are much more curatorial and art in and of themselves, and put them back on these older formats. And I think partially what becomes really fascinating there is that they saw this as a way of ensuring access in the long term to the content. And also, as we can get into more, a way to circumvent some of the legal concerns they knew were at play by redistributing stuff they didn't have like permission to do so, right? Because as I sort of try to spell out in the article and how some of the participants talk to me, you can go with the right digital forensics tools and go find stuff that people have circulated digitally, right? What you can't as easily do is buy somebody's VHS tape and prove that there's content on it, right? So a lot of the way that these folks were selling or distributing their media
Whoa.
played
Yeah.
into this, right? So you'll sort of see in these spaces, they won't call it a release of X, Y, or Z media. It'll be a art piece in which the name of the media is tied to it, right? So you're buying a quote unquote VHS art piece that, as many participants said, may or may not play when you get it to your house, right? So there's like these extra layers of like, it wasn't simply frustrations with ownership to media, but an understanding that the circulation of that ownership is different. Yeah.
Yeah. No, and I think as we all like the digital forensics tools are well, I mean, I think everyone got a crash course in this with those Epstein videos where they're like, we looked at this file long enough and we can tell you who edited it and when. And it's just like, oh my God, that's so much information that's on those files. And so that that makes sense that there's this kind of organic wall
Mhm.
that happens when you like rip and when you do a full file conversion. It it also strikes me though, and maybe this gets into the another element of it, is that, well, first off, listeners who, again, this is one of those episodes where really potentially, is there a good place to see some of this? Like, if I was
Yeah.
stop the podcast right now and go and check out,
Mhm. So
uh,
there are certainly people on the up and up doing retro conversion artwork that is like following all of the sort of work with an artist, create content. The biggest one who I mentioned at the onset of the article is Lunchmeat VHS, who you may be familiar with his work, tends to do these like collaborative vaporwavy projects. So you can see something like that in his work, right? So I'd really encourage you to check that out. Um, so that's yeah, that would be a place to start. Otherwise, if I give too many out loud suggestions, I might be directing folks to things that
no. This we have a specifically a no narc
yeah,
podcast. However, if you go to
yeah,
lunchmeatvhs.com, you can see,
unnarkable
uh,
content.
yeah, Meet the VHS Collector, VHS Poems, had some VHS. Okay, Waves Crashing Piano Chords, Complete Video Collection VHS. Um, so this is well, actually, this seems like that's not what I thought it was, which was Vaporwave. This is a whole Juggalo related art performance piece. But
Yeah.
I would say, dear listener, go take a second, check out that website, and then come back and have a better sense of what we're talking about. And so my point being is that that idea of that these people are presenting themselves um as artists to a certain extent, as curators, and that what they're doing is not just straight bootlegging, but is, which, dear listener, is an art form in and of itself, trademark quality, grabbed some of the great, certainly in my neck of the woods, Zeppelin performances of all time, and we owe them all a great debt of gratitude. But that's not what they're doing, and I think that part of it is that some of these really are art pieces. They're extraordinary physical, visual objects. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about some of your, again, without naming any too many details, some of your favorites, just to give us a flavor.
Absolutely. And I'll say that like one of the questions that I asked these folks when I talked to them, right? Because I ascribed onto them this idea of retro conversion artists, right? So like I asked them if they felt like they were artists. Like I always like to sort of see how people understand their work. And it was a sort of mixture of people who were doing incredible aesthetic design to these tapes. Now, that can mean like going and finding all the Veggie Tales tapes you can find because they were released on green cassettes. So you could take them and spool swap stuff and make it look cool. And you're like, oh, I released this video that is on a green tape that ties to some release that was out at the time. There was also hand painting. People would go in and purposely put flowers on, say, a release of Midsummer to sort of tie to the film. But the other component to it is, they're selling these as uh, pieces that evoke a particular nostalgia. So a lot of people would try to take a Warner Brothers design from their VHSs and put onto that, instead of an era specific copy of The Shining, it's something more contemporary like Terrifier 2, but it has the Warner Brothers 2 aesthetic. So some graphic design work that is not insignificant and require an incredible use of technical design tools to do that work, right? Anybody else who is doing that, we'd call a graphic artist, right? Like we'd have no problem
Right.
calling that. But I think there was tension, like folks would say, "Oh, I'm not seen as an artist because people think all I'm doing is transferring a tape to another tape, right? Never mind all of the digital suite of tools they need to edit to make that work." And the other thing that I think is really fascinating here that was not inherently an artist practice, but like the sort of curation work that they were doing that was shared was like they would start to identify collectively through, Facebook groups, through Reddit conversations, types of tapes that were really useful to this work.
Mm-hmm.
So everyone is noticing, oh, if I go to Goodwill, there's lots of two tape copies of Sound of Music, which are 3 hour long tapes. So I can put 3 hours of content on each of them, right? Or the extended cut of Lord of the Rings, which was on VHS, right? So they're also taking, junk copies of media and using them to get as much valuable utility out of a tape as possible, right?
Not calling my beloved extended edition Lord of the Rings. No.
And I don't mean that that's not valuable, right? But what they were seeing is like, oh, everyone who wants this has like a Blu-ray disc copy of it, which is one disc and it has all the movies on it. What I don't need is a 3 to 4 tape extended edition because, so it's like here's a particular form of obsolete media that's showing up a lot. Let me repurpose it in the most efficient way possible, right? Um, and I don't know how much your listeners care about like the quality of VHS tapes, but like there's the extended play versus standard play, right? So these tapes also were recorded on a nicer form of tape, so they do better transfer than buying like the 8 hour like blank tape and getting like really poor quality transfer, right? So it's all of these like unique considerations to the tape itself that allowed aesthetics to come out. So again, I think deeply artistic practices that we might think are just curation concerns, right?
And this, though, also thinking about all of that, there is an interesting, what you said about Lord of the Rings, right? Makes it a huge amount of, I think probably anyone listening to this, it'll be obvious to a certain extent, like, yeah, everyone who likes Lord of the Rings either rents it on streaming or has a Blu-ray collection of those movies. And it makes like a certain level of intuitive sense about why it wouldn't be really cool to have that on VHS, especially because it's kind of a cuspy VHS release, right? Like it's almost the period of time where you might want movies of right around that release moment to be retro converted.
Yeah.
But so I wonder if you could like talk through what makes
A good one.
something a good retro conversion object,
Yeah, absolutely.
base for improvisation.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question. So one of the clearest ways, and actually I think Lord of the Rings is relevant here again, is like if it did have that sort of like relational previous version that was on an obsolete format, right? So we might see, forgive me, I can't think of the name of the Amazon Lord of the Rings series, right? We might see somebody take that and then push it back to tape. Because like I remember watching Fellowship of the Ring on tape. I would like to watch this on tape as well, right? So they're imagining that sort of use for the entire series. So, of course, Star Wars is super relevant here, though I don't think I talked to a lot of retro conversion artists who even tried to do Star Wars releases for the obvious reasons that you don't even want to mess around with Disney as a like intellectual
Oh, but like Andor
yeah,
on
and or on
VHS
VHS would be the dream, right?
would be the dream.
Yeah,
I see.
yeah. The most common, and like to me, it wasn't surprising, but it might be worth contextualizing to folks, is like contemporary horror was like the thing that people wanted on VHS, right? Because they think of like this sort of not golden era of horror, maybe not the right, but like this 80s aesthetic of horror that is like everyone's trying to chase and return to. So like things that evoked that but were released digitally, they wanted to sort of push back to this more like grainy, like washed out VHS aesthetic, right? And then many artists that I talked to said, I think it deserves to look this way. And I was like, well, I tried my best not to like, as a social scientist, you don't want to like push back on your researchers. But like I was like, well, there's an entire series of movies that are called VHS that do this, right? But again, this idea of like something about the haptic material encounter with it. It's like I want to imagine that when I'm watching Terrifier 2, I put it into my VCR and I'm consuming it that way, right? So there's this also nostalgia component to it that is super fascinating,
And then
right?
in that, and we're gonna get into the more nostalgia stuff because I think that's one of the really powerful things about all of this is like it it's such a fascinating angle into the ways that nostalgia is
Mhm.
functioning. And if we think about nostalgia as It's like a wonderful book I read in college called Svetlana Boyum. It's like The Future of Nostalgia, I think is what it's called. But it like kind of talks about like historicizing nostalgia as a human practice, and kind of saying that like people have always been sad about the past that's gone, right? Like from the Iliad, or rather the Odyssey on down. But like she kind of argues that there's a moment where like in the 19th century where you get something that looks and that is called nostalgia, and that then nostalgia changes over time like anything else. It's not one nostalgia. And so I do think that one of the, we'll talk about nostalgia because I do think that this gives us fascinating insight into the way that algorithms and creator culture and streaming and new property relations around media are shifting how nostalgia functions and how nostalgia can give us insight into all of those. But before that, this is like a weird, funny technical question, but when you were talking about this, these new horror films deserve to be on the grainy 80s aesthetic, but you also kind of talked about how high-end certain kinds of VHSs produce better quality tapes. So is there kind of an optimal level of graininess in these products? Is it like, can it be too grainy or like not grainy enough? Are they putting digital graininess on things so they can better control the level of VHS grain?
Yeah, so the answer is both to that question, right? So some artists purposely got into their like Final Cut Pro or whatever video editing software and would overdo these like VHS aesthetics, right? So you could see the sort of, it's like a head trip to watch, right? Because you can see the digital way that it's showing up and then the actual ways that the tape is doing it itself. So there was a sort of like fake graininess, but also on the other side of this, like some artists were producing these to people who never actually dealt with VHS tapes before, but they saw I'm just gonna again hypothetical example here. They saw like a VHS copy of Barbie and they're like, oh, that's cool. I want a pink VHS copy of Barbie. Hypothetically, nobody has sold that, right? But they would get them and they'd have these sort of fuzz dropout moments that any sort of analog media like that would have. And they'd come back to the sellers and be like, I want a refund because it looks bad. And they're like, what do you mean it looks bad? And it would be the sort of aesthetics that are of that era, right? So there is both the consumer who grew up with it and like that, but there are people who are like, oh, I was told this is cool or it's like a record, and it is like you get pops and fizzles on records, but you tend not to return them unless they can't play, right? So I think there is to your question, there's both a choice to make it look that way that can be done digitally, but also it's just you're up to the gamble of like any given tape, right? Because it's not a stable medium the way other like film is, right? Film, as long as you leave it alone in a shelf stable space, nothing bad will happen to it. Tape will rot regardless of what you do to it, right? Yeah.
And deteriorates with
Yeah.
plays. Like we as
Yes. Yeah,
kids,
absolutely.
anyone who grew up with VHSs remembers like playing out tapes and they start
Yeah.
breaking and they
Mhm.
um
Yeah. But also, and again, I like what I was really this what dug me into this group is like even when you don't play magnetic media, it deteriorates. So it's like just a wild gamble to put things onto, right? So you're just like selling things and hoping, or distributing more accurately, things and hoping that they don't eventually decay, right?
or knowing that they will, but that will be part of the vibiness
Yeah, yeah.
of it.
Yeah. For a particular imagined consumer for these sellers, right? Again, I think what I saw was that some younger consumers just did not have that like familiarity with the medium and were truly surprised that it looked bad or that it would break arbitrarily, right?
I mean, yeah, no, VHS is like it's been years now, but like 5 or 7 years ago, I went back to some weird movie that I'm just like, oh yeah, before DVDs, everything wasn't clear. Like
Yeah.
it's a lower, it can be. It's it's different than the like vinyl CD argument or
Yeah.
whatever. So the person who potentially,
Mhm.
hypothetically, bought a Barbie,
Mhm.
a pink VHS of a Barbie,
Yeah.
went home and went to watch Barbie. And this is where I'm trying to get a sense of like the use
Mhm.
of these things and how
Yeah.
they fit into a media landscape. Because I mean,
Mhm.
that's part of one of the other ways that it's different than bootlegging. It's not
Mhm.
always. You write about some people in the article who seem like they're copying things because these things literally don't exist
Mhm.
elsewhere. But it does seem like the way these things are being. I'm interested to know more about the way these things are being used because it strikes me that like, comparing it to records where there's this large market for people who sometimes listen to vinyl, but
Mhm.
vinyl has enormous drawbacks in comparison to streaming audio, namely that you can't move it around I mean, you can, but believe me, it is a hassle. You can't listen to it in your car. You can't listen to it on a run. So
Mhm.
if you have, um, Rise and Fall of a Midwestern Pop Princess on vinyl, that can be a meaningful totemic object for you, and it can do things for you as an element of
Mhm.
consumer culture related to music, as an element of commodified culture, but it's being used in an ancillary way, I would imagine, to the other kinds of music. It's part of this broader suite of the ways you're going to be listening to that
Mhm.
record. I'm just
Mhm.
wondering if that's the same thing for these, or but it's straight. It seems like it's kind of different, actually. Maybe.
I can only sort of like I can't speak to the audience because I didn't talk to folks who purchased this. I had talked to the folks who distributed it, but I can speculate if that's a useful
Yeah,
thing.
speculate. We
Yeah.
encourage speculation on this podcast for
So
sure.
if I think of like the difference between like playing something on Spotify and watching something on a streaming service or even YouTube is like when there's a slip up to a video of any sort, it becomes so aggressively transparent, right? It either freezes and I get like the circle thing and it interrupts the sort of consumer experience, or any sort of dropout in the streaming causes it to be incredibly pixelated. And that's a bummer to think about, right? Because you're just like, oh, well, I'm now aware of the sort of experience of viewing this, right? So
Yeah.
even with the sort of decrease in aesthetic quality or the increase if you really like the aesthetic of video, I think that lack of failure consistently might be part of it.
Hmm.
So I think there's that, right? And um, I am increasingly, this is just me feeling old, but like noticing how difficult it is to just watch a video on the internet without having to be back in like pre-internet cable consumption, where there's like commercials at the beginning, middle, and throughout things on most streaming platforms that aren't Netflix, right? Is like this like idea that you've gotten back into a something's being given to you that you have to consume. So I think when artists did imagine what like users enjoyed about it, it's like, well, I give them the tape and they can watch, stop, and engage with it whatever they want, but they're not dictated through some other like, oh, in order to watch this Amazon, in order to watch the Lord of the Rings Amazon show, you have to watch 10 ads for seven other Amazon shows, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's partially that, right? Which you could get with a DVD. So so there is like that nostalgia component to it that I think it's just far enough in the rearview mirrors for folks that it seems cool as well as having this particular affordance to it. Yeah.
So, yeah, and then the nostalgia thing is I think it's really worth talking about because I do feel like it's kind of the crux of this. And for me, the fascinating thing about it is nostalgia. It seems to me, and correct. I'd be interested to hear your take, or correct me if I'm wrong. It's always invented. That's kind of the whole thing, right? It's there's you can't be nostalgic for something as it's happening now.
Mhm.
Not exactly. Um, and you can, right, it's always a looking back, and that space from the past, that the absence of the past is what creates, is central to the feeling of nostalgia. Um, Without the distance, there is no nostalgia. Um, and so, to a certain extent, it's always created. It's always imagined, right? It's always a product of the present's relationship to the past. But what's kind of, I think if we think about nostalgia, especially if we think about political nostalgia, um, there's often a refusal, I think, of that inventedness, right? It's like, no, the 60s really were like that, or the 50s really were like that. Um, and so that's part, and in fact, if you say, like, oh, it actually, the fishing wasn't that great, the beers weren't that cold. Do you remember all the times when we like just stood around and did nothing? It kind of undoes the nostalgia, right? That fantasy is part of it. And what's kind of remarkable about this, and I know nothing else like this, is
Mhm.
in the less in the like the ones where they're taking a movie that would have an aesthetic and putting it back
Mhm.
in its old aesthetic, modern horror, 80s horror. That to me is like there's a certain amount of that's a clean, like almost like historical what if. But the ones that are more creative, not more creative, more curatorial in some ways, that you showed in the talk and you mentioned some in the article, in particular the the Vine compilation VHSs, where Vine is such a digital imprint, right?
Mhm.
It's not analog. It's a phone app, right? Like by definition, Vine is digital and not analog. And yet it also is in the past, and it's a
Mhm.
specific era of internet. So anyway, yeah, the sense that the this is nostalgia that admits it's invented in a remarkable way, like nothing else I've ever imagined, I don't
Yeah.
think.
So it makes me think of two things. I think I do genuinely think the Vine one was just like a bit that somebody was like, this is real funny to do, but it's like fascinating that somebody took a short form video platform like that and then remediated it back to tape. The one that comes to mind is there's like a couple of different retro conversion artists who do like these like early 2000s YouTube compilations, and that to me is like a fascinating example because that is that sort of intersection that we were talking about earlier where like VHS was dying as a viable format, right? Because it was like 2006 when History of Violence was released, and that was like the last theatrical release for a tape, right? Is also the same year that YouTube sort of came to prominence, right? So I think you're seeing a group of people grapple with two media cultures like colliding and trying to there what is happening, right, that I think is fascinating is like I can't find that digital culture anymore on YouTube, but I can find these sort of tapes that I recorded and preserved stuff onto. So maybe that's where I drag this thing back to, right? Because at least then I know that I had control of its distribution and use, right? And again, without going deep into the weeds of just like how poor we've been like preserving our digital ecosystems, like it is like it's easier to
Oh, I
prove
know.
that I can save something on a tape than it is to prove I can save something from YouTube, right? So I think it's interesting to see that as a particular site of creation for these folks because it is like nostalgia in two directions in some ways, right? Like the nostalgia for pre-internet media, but also nostalgia for the hopefulness of that early internet, or not early internet, early streaming video, early like YouTube moment.
Oh no, and I think that has a fascinating and I think really astute sense of media history in that kind of drawing at least an implicit, maybe an explicit, I don't know, connection between kind of home movie culture and the ways that tape, to a certain extent in VHS, certainly true
Mm.
in cassette tape, is transformative in the fact that users can make their own, and drawing a direct connection to early YouTube, where it's like, oh, users can make their own internet culture easily in a different way.
Yeah, and the other thing I want to sort of point out, and I tried to draw this out the best I could in the article, in as much as you can in a literature review, is like the first thing that media companies tried to do when they realized that they like the digital platforms were an option is like this will be how we stop bootlegging from happening, right? If we only release
Yeah.
things digitally, people can't bootleg it, right? So, I mean, that was at least the argument they were circulating. It's like if we have control over them in these digital platforms, right, that will deter circulation. So now, in some sort of beautiful counter moment. People are like, yeah, but now we're refusing that and pulling things. We now have a technology that lets us easily pull things back to analog, right? There were certainly technologies that a person could use to put digital things back onto tape in the 2000s, but there weren't like consumer level materials that you could do this with, right? So I think that's also part of it has been like a refusal to let that like culture like get pushed out due to copyright arguments and things like that.
And, you said a minute ago about kind of, again, how this is a nostalgia in two ways. He said it's nostalgia for VHS culture, and it's nostalgia for the hope of that
Mhm.
early internet moment, which, it is funny if we think about it. If you wanted to do like a quick, vulgar Marxist take, you'd be like, that's nostalgia for the two
Mhm.
last moments of relatively widespread American prosperity. It's like 1998, 2006 are like right before the bubble bursts in the
Mhm.
middle of the Clinton 90s, which kind of the high point of VHS culture in many ways. I mean, you know more about that's what I imagine when I think of
Mhm.
VHS culture. And then again, this early internet, but right pre 2008
Mhm.
crisis moment. But yeah, I'm just wondering what you think that why is that nostalgia so effective? Because it makes again what startled me about this was all this. I was like, oh, I get that. That makes
Yep.
cultural sense to me, but I'm struggling to articulate
Yeah, I
why.
mean, this is something I tried to, and I still want to do more with out of the research that it is. Like, I think the other thing that the artists I talk to are responding to is their own attempt to be visible as artists themselves, right? So part of this was like finding a niche that folks at the time weren't really doing, but as I describe, is much has blown up quite a bit since then. And unfortunately, a lot of these like bigger production companies have also started releasing VHS tapes as well, right? But I say all that to say that I think what they're responding to is like just to use the phrase out of hand, like the attention economy of it all, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
they see this creation as much more localized and much more intimate than having to just get really popular on a social media platform. So I think that like the nostalgia is also to the like the much more circulated nature of this older format, right? Sure, they need to sell copies and sure it's beneficial to their careers if they make money, but I don't think they see it as the same as being like, I need to create a piece of art that gets the most likes on this platform, right? And I know that's not what you're asking, but I think
Yeah,
that's part of the equation here.
that makes so much sense. Partially because in this crazy way, the very nature of this process of retroconversion means that it at some level the real thing can't be, it's the anti NFT, right? The real thing can't be shared digitally because by definition it is a VHS. Sure, you can see a digital version of this VHS transfer, but like that's not the actual thing. So it's almost like virality can help their business, but it can't, as video artists, it can't be their business maybe in a way that would be true for almost anyone else making video content
Yeah,
in
I mean, it's
2025.
it's sparking interesting thoughts for me, right? And I know this has also has nothing to do with music, but it's making me think too of like the sort of Pokemon card collecting phenomena where it's like it's not about the value of the cards, it's about the sort of like Twitch streams where you're like, oh, what am I going to pull? And this is going to yield more views, right? And I think it's right to sort of say that there's something about like it's an artifact that you own and is rare, but doesn't have the need to be proved or commodified in a digital way, right? Yeah.
And yeah, and from that perspective, I think that then the use of these media forms is a really canny act of kind of cultural media criticism.
Mhm.
Is that it's part of the nostalgia is for this earlier moment of culture, which, and maybe this is why on the face of it it can seem not silly, but a little absurd, right? It's like it's not as if like the 90s were like a paragon of a pre-commercial American society or culture, but there have been specific
Mhm.
changes to what it means to make culture, what it means to consume culture, that yeah, like you're saying, the internet and the attention economy have generated, that this move pushes back against, I think, in like kind of a, and reminds you precisely through that nostalgia of like, oh, it didn't used to be like this exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I really want to harp home like the only way to know whether or not your retro conversion art piece works or not is to put it in a VCR, right? Like it's like the it has to be taken offline in a fundamental way that I think is really fascinating here.
Yeah, yeah. And it also, I mean, it makes me also think about this kind of broader suite of kind of online nostalgias, um, and the way that this can feel like the final step of this, I would say, even much larger
Mhm.
moment of cultural imagination.
Mhm.
Um, I was kind of just leaving college when like the first like vaporwave, uh hauntological indie thing was like the weird hip thing for like a second and a half, but much beyond the imaginations of like the the wildest, I don't know, like Ariel Pink
Yeah.
fantasy, is like how big, how many views
Mhm.
these like, I don't know, I have a friend who when he works he watches or has on the background like city pop music, which I cannot tell if it's real city pop or new city pop, with, or like AI city pop, with kind of again these visuals of like kind of 80s Japan.
Yeah.
And this feels like that next step of that kind of broader, and
Yeah.
they sound old, and and the images are kind of intentionally washed out and grainy, and this is, it feels like there's this much even larger ecosystem of people who find
Yeah.
something attractive in that cultural mode.
Yeah, so I will say I agree, and I will be admit to guilt that I am one of those people who has that on. I think I have like a playlist on YouTube right now that's straight up called Nostalgia Gamers Only, chill wave and retro game combos, and then it's just like unclear whether or not it's a bunch of video game footage of the robot like compiled together or not. But what I want to sort of say here is I don't think as much as it is well, I think it's a next step, you're right, but I think what is the next step in is like how integral these spaces, AI generated or not, have done to, for lack of better words, be responsible for cultural curation. And by that I mean so
Yeah.
much of this is mired in like extra legal like copyright that it ends up just getting thrown to the wayside, right? A lot of what is implicit in this project and in my work more broadly is that like these types of artists step in when no media company will cares about preserving their stuff. There's no like logical end goal for them, right? Because they can't make money off of archiving, right? At least not royalties in the way they would creating new media. But also no archive is going to take on the responsibility of archiving these things because they're a copyright nightmare and they can't like do anything with them or they can't allow researchers to use them because they don't have copyright either.
Yeah.
Like communities of practice step in to do that. So it's an imperfect sort of archive of these media cultures, but it is an archive nonetheless. And what I think is that in that way, it's a logical next step where it's like, yes, well, some of this can happen online, but some of it has to happen physically as well, which if you talk to any archivist is like the classic sort of like archives approach. It's like lots of copies keep stuff safe. Some of them have to be digital, some of them have to be physical, and they have to be distributed in multiple ways, right? So it's wildly outside of the legal purview, but it is doing a preservation job that simply isn't being done elsewhere, right?
So, Travis, as someone engaged with archival sciences and archivists, would you say that putting all these things on magnetic tape was the best and most secure way to?
Absolutely not. I am this is anathema to some of my colleagues, but I am a big proponent of like digitization as the solution for a lot of our like cultural preservation. It's just the sort of nature that physical things take up space in a way that digital things don't. So they have um, curatorial value in that it's important sometimes to experience things in the context of how they were consumed, right? When you saw me present at Northeast Historic, I was playing these tapes on like a massive like theater screen through a computer, right? So we were still getting a digital version of it. The ideal consumption would be I would have drug a CRT TV up to the front, popped in a VCR, and then you would have got that fuzziness and that some of those tapes would have looked all the nicer. But that has cultural relevancy that's just not sustainable, right? So some of it has to be digital in nature, right? But I
Yeah.
think having artifacts as case studies is always a good part of this, right?
Yeah, no, 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 totally. That makes sense. In the way that some parts of this, thinking about that, there was like an article that went around about how a lot of the kind of early video game aesthetic is actually incorrect, or
Yeah.
our understanding of it is incorrect because on a CRT TV,
Yeah.
these what seem very pixelated actually look incredible a lot of times.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I have an example I always give, and I teach students in digital preservation classes. I always give the example of playing like Donkey Kong Country on my Nintendo Switch on like a HD TV, and my partner walks in and she's like, "That looks like shit." And I was like, "Yeah, I know, because it wasn't designed to be played on this, but then I put it on the CRT and it's just like absolutely stunning, right?" So there are moments where that curation is relevant, but it's not sustainable. And I think solutions we see are some of that like digital aesthetic altering, right? So a lot of emulators will now have like a CRT filter that you can put over, right? So
Yeah.
it's figured out that the issue isn't the game, but a sort of way that you have to like hypermediate it, right?
So as we kind of start to wrap up here, I just one of the things I think that is fascinating about this. I'd be really interested. I find fascinating about this. Be really interested to hear what your thoughts on is it's the way all this plays with temporality.
Mhm.
Because first when I was prepping for this and when I saw the talk, I thought of this as like a really interesting example in many ways of the post history moment we're in, and one that Saxon and I talk about a lot with music, right? That the lack of an actual physical trace in these platforms, right? So it's unclear sometimes on Spotify with major artists. It's like unclear when an album was actually released or the order in which albums are released. There's no liner notes, all that stuff, which means that I think it's been dismissed as like, oh, who cares, but actually means that there's nothing anchoring these things down and they can
Mhm.
start to float around, but then has been kind of just put into overdrive with the kind of TikTokization of music culture, which I think partially algorithmic, partially changes in the way the US economy means there aren't new sounds making old sounds obviously obsolete in different ways. Those are related in all kinds of complicated ways.
Mhm.
But the sense of like what's new music if sometimes a stoner rock band, stoner metal band from last released an album at like 92, 93 it is like completely rediscovered, is that in a post temporality environment, is that new music, is that old music, really unclear. And so it scrambled the music industry. And so I thought of this as kind of an example of that like an anti-temporality almost, and an embrace of anti-temporality. But in this conversation, I'm actually also convinced that there's a really powerful
Mhm.
a nuanced understanding of temporality in
Yeah.
this artistic practice.
Yeah, and this makes me think of an example. I know you saw me sort of screen, and it was part of one of those imagine early YouTube compilations, right? And it was a particular artist who was like, hey, here is like Chocolate Rain, here's Leroy Jenkins, here's one of the G.I. Joe's videos, but inserted in it, here's a video that I made on YouTube in 2006 that never went viral. But because I'm making the compilation, I can imagine that it did, and I owe that to myself, right? And he has like this little description that says, I'm doing a favor to a younger version of myself by imagining that I went viral, right? So to me, that is, I think, perhaps anti-temporal, but also being like, yeah, like what does going viral mean anymore, right? And being able to be like, well, I get to say in this artistic format that I was successful, right? So it is like both nostalgic and hopeful simultaneously, which I don't know if that's like temporally possible, but it's a cool example of things that people are doing in this space, right?
Yeah, but I mean, I guess there's like if you're a 17-year-old in the this corner of the internet, like, and you're into these aesthetics, you're into hard, like the mainstream of retroconversion, which is kind of a funny thing to say, but like you're into retro horror aesthetics,
Mhm.
but of movies that may or may not have been originally on VHS. I mean, there is something destructive is way too strong a word, but there is something I feel like somewhat
Yeah, yeah.
anti-temporal about that.
Yeah, I would just say that I agree. Do I think that folks are knowingly converting to this to be like, oh, it will destroy itself one day? Possibly not, but I do think that they know that the other alternatives, which might be to release these into digital ecosystems that they don't know the long-term viability
Yeah.
of or any control of it, is not a solution. So they're seeing this as a direction against that, right? So in that way, yeah, I think it is different, maybe not destructive, at least the
Yeah.
like.
No, and having that, and maybe this is the final thing, and the thing we haven't talked to that much is also, I think, what do you think the power of the physicality of these objects are? You said before the only way to tell if your media works is to actually put it in. But it feels like that's another part of this rejection of streaming, really, which I is what do you think that is?
I think it is we live in a weird time where ownership of physical things is um nefarious, and I don't know a better word there. And I don't mean just like what media do I own, but I mean like anything I own, my data, these types of things, right? So this like absolute like ripping the band-aid off and putting things into a physical space is an active explicit rebellion against copyright, against automation, against anything that could, like, you're unclear on how it might be misused, but you know that something's going on, right?
Yeah.
So it's like paranoia, and my response is to take it entirely out of that ecosystem entirely. And I think what we're going to see is across a lot of other media and print and production formats that like aggressive shift away from that, right? But what that's going to look like and how how that's going to immediately get commodified, I'm sure, is worth thinking about. Again, I don't want to underemphasize how quickly like A24 was like, oh yeah, we're also making VHS tapes now, right? Like they
Right.
saw they saw the thing and responded, right?
No, and
And
and no, that makes so much sense. And there is something amazing about, like, I feel like again,
Mhm.
one of the elements of this I find so striking is just
Mhm.
the self consciousness of the imagination of it. Right? It's not making an argument like, oh, this is actually as convenient. Maybe it says it on the app, but like you're like, no, no, no. I'm not. Not only this is not the way it was supposed to be. This is the way like it was supposed to have been.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
in a
yeah,
better world, this is what it looks like, and I'm actually
yeah.
gonna spend my money in that active imagination.
Yeah, and I would say like it could have been, and I think in earnest, a few folks like, and I can if I keep at this and get successful enough, we can go back to to this version of it, right? I mean, that's wildly optimistic, and of course, not proven by any sort of like streaming or Hollywood blockbuster means. But I think there is a belief that they're doing something akin to that.
Well, Travis, from your lips to I don't know some timeline. uh, Thank you so much for coming on and talking about this. I like if this has piqued your interest, like very much poke around the wilds of Reddit, find some examples,
Yeah.
buy a VHS art project or two. Um,
Yeah, you can go. I will say if you go to Etsy and type in VHS art piece, you will find what you're looking for.
um, Travis, anything else that you want to send our listeners to?
No, not particularly at the moment. I will say that this project is part of a larger question I'm grappling with about like the role of obsolescence in media history, particularly histories of marginalized identities. So like keep an eye out for work related to that and how folks have been doing weird stuff like this alongside any sort of emergent technology. But yeah, this has been great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.